Already, by 2:15 a.m., the SEAD operation, or Suppression of Enemy Air Defense Operations, had gone off without any issues whatsoever at all. The 181st Combined Arms Brigade of the 77th PLA Group Army had been given two prime directives for its initial opening movements. One directive was to surround and destroy, in addition to providing ample artillery support and fire upon the air defense battalions of these various Patriot battalions, the 5th of the 5th, the 4th of the 3rd, and the 2nd of the 3rd, and the headquarters of Headquarters Battery, in addition to the various missile salvos coming in upon the clock striking 2 a.m. with the first volleys of YJ-18C container-based cruise missiles, in addition to their Caliber K or Club K cousins, firing from their various container disguise systems hidden all throughout the country, and various systems that were hidden close by, firing their first volleys, had targeted various areas throughout the installation. Due to China's ISR superiority and dominance with their constellation of reconnaissance drones, aircraft, and satellites, the exact positions of the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade had been identified for immediate destruction as the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, a Trojan brigade of Chinese Strategic Missile Forces elements in eastern Texas that were equipped with the DF-11A, the DF-15C, the DF-15B, and the DF-21, fired their longer range DF-15Bs and DF-21As at various targets throughout the entire installation, especially in an attempt to aid the suppression of enemy air defenses operation, which was the absolute top priority of all of the forces on this map. As all these forces were a combined arms element from the very potent fixed-wing air power that entered the area to assist the ground troops and carry out their own strategic or tactical strike missions, these forces contributed the electronic warfare element to this specific battle, as the PLA strategic bomber fleet of its 8 H-6Ks, one of which was utilized to drop its munitions on the Shepherd Air Base, while another had been diverted and sent north instead due to the lack of need of it, as the Shepherd Air Base was taken within 35 minutes. The two aircraft out of the entire squadron had been equipped previously with the KG-600 jamming pods. Although not all of China's bombers had been equipped with electronic warfare assets such as these, very many of them had been, and these specific bombers equipped with these were dispersed throughout China's various bomber squadrons, as China had an enormous strategic bomber fleet, as did Russia. These two strategic bombers here were equipped with the KG-600 jamming pods, which work to jam American radar systems, such as those used by the Patriot system, to track and lock onto targets for accurately firing their ground-to-air missiles in the air defense role, as well as jamming redundant systems such as American radios, as within the area they covered a 100-mile diameter around their aircraft. As this was occurring, and the Americans were beginning to be annihilated in pockets as they were surrounded and viciously destroyed by a combination of armor, infantry fighting vehicles, and APCs, in addition to the artillery strikes coming from the 155mm PLZ-05 howitzers firing their very potent 155 shells at all of the different air defense forces, in addition to the YJ-18C cruise missile strikes and the DF-15B and DF-21As, and also CH-901A loitering munitions fired by the Headquarters Battalion's drone sections of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade, arming them with the HEAT warheads, or the high explosive anti-tank warheads, and sending them to support the ground troops in their operations. All of the forces of the 77th Group Army, being that they were an active duty PLA ground forces unit, were equipped with all of the latest and greatest of the Chinese military hardware. Many of these were essentially being freshly produced off the assembly lines and were completely brand new in terms of hardware and design, and in the time that they were manufactured, literally coming off assembly lines only in previous years. As the very mighty Type 99A main battle tank equipped the tank companies of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade's Armored Battalion, along with the very highly protected, up-armored, very modern, low-profile VN-20 infantry fighting vehicles that was like essentially taking the already very impressive ZBD-04A and adding even more armor protection to it. They equipped the armored infantry forces, or in other words, the mechanized infantry forces within the armored companies, and also the regular mechanized infantry forces of the mechanized infantry battalions, along with the Type 89A, which was an upgraded model of the Type 89 armor personnel carrier. The artillery forces were equipped with the longest range rocket artillery system in the world, the A300, which had a maximum range at its longest reach of 187 miles, the longest rocket artillery by far, with its extended range rockets due to their extended engines being a much longer rocket. These systems fired at the Sherman Air Force Base, while the two closer-in battalions of rocket artillery, being comprised of the newer, upgraded version of the original PHL-81 truck-based or Grad-like multiple launch rocket systems. These were very heavily armored for an artillery system, for a rocket system, chassis and cab, equipped with a new fire control system, as well as computers and communications equipment and combat data links, as every vehicle by now had combat data links. And these could also fire extended range ammunition, although such wouldn't be needed for this area because this map, this entire AO, was literally 18 by 22 miles in width and length from north to south, east to west. So therefore, they were well within range of hitting their targets on the installation. As 215 had struck, this counterattack by the 3rd of the 2nd's now dismounted infantry air defense troops, as they were now only equipped with their small arms, having had abandoned their vehicles as missiles began to strike and destroy entire batteries worth of them within their battalion, along with artillery strikes. They had ran first to get away to the east before turning around and attempting a ill-fated counterattack to try to relieve their comrades trapped inside of this pocket created by these two battalions, the Armored Battalion of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade and one of its mechanized infantry battalions, which had surrounded them as they moved into the area, spread out, and encapsulated them as missiles began to hit with great precision, both tactical ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, as well as artillery from the 155 millimeter howitzers of their artillery battalion of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade, firing its very potent 155 shells from their PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers. They also hit the 5th of the 5th and the 3rd of the 2nd, who abandoned their vehicles the survivors abandoned their vehicles and tried a counterattack but failed, as they ran into the armored phalanxes of these two battalions, the armored and mechanized infantry. They were parried and destroyed before these forces now received orders to move into the main installation, to cut off retreat in the north and also strike at it coming in from the west, now that they had freshly defeated and achieved their first objective, which was victory and success during their suppression of enemy air defense operation against the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, having had successfully destroyed it, and now began to move in to strike the installation. There were many training units on this installation, as this was a TRADOC post, as well as many cadets or recruits or trainees, if you will, all receiving either 13 Bravo or Field Artillery Cannoneer training or different other types of training, as Fort Sill had other types of basic training and AIT programs. There was the first of the 154th MP Battalion, who was responsible for the installation, although they were broken up and spread throughout the installation, in addition to the skeleton crew of the 434th Field Artillery Brigade, a training brigade, most of which was deployed for force protection in the Shepherd Air Force Base. There were skeleton crews remaining of some of their battalions. And also there was the 428th Field Artillery Brigade, which itself was a training brigade as well. And the 2nd of the 6th Air Defense Artillery Regiment was a training battalion, a schoolhouse battalion for air defense artillery, for training air defense troops, right here. And the 1st of the 30th and the 2nd of the 2nd were both of the 428th Field Artillery Brigade training units, in other words, and their motor pools and other such support facilities were located in this part of the installation. As the heavy strategic bombers circled the area readying for their strikes, as the WZ-7 orbiting the area and the CH-4A armed reconnaissance, high-altitude reconnaissance drone was likewise doing the same, relaying constant streams of data into the AI system, as AI once again played an enormous role in this invasion, streamlining the data processing of real-time battlefield information, making it possible to do things that could never have been done before insofar as a level of speed and precision as it related to the Chinese and other coalition troops, and as it also related to how they best deployed and utilized their resources in any given situation. The AI streamlined this process so rapidly that it made the forces extremely flexible in their responses to the developing tactical and strategic situations as it related to the overall situation around the land and tactical situations within specific battles. This was very important to understand. This was the reality of modern warfare, and America lagged behind in this, as well as ISR capabilities. As, once again, the Chinese forces had quadcopter recon drones at the individual squad levels. They had platoon level drones and up. America only had macro level drones similar to the WZ-7, like the MQ-9 Reaper or Predator drones. They didn't have a drone doctrine for all of their forces. They did not have drones at the squad and platoon level, and barely at the company level in some cases. They were typically found in specialized units, or they were found at higher levels like battalion or brigade levels at best. These forces were now smashed by 215, and the forces were ordered again to move on. As that was occurring, the first air raids were now beginning to occur, as one battalion of the combat engineers moved in to seize and clear the southwest corner airfield, along with 2 battalions moving to hit all of these forces as the 75th Field Artillery Brigade was conducting training exercises, trying to simulate a real training environment with live ammunition, as well as their troops using different mock-up of FOBs and other facilities to do their training, even mock-up of cities, as these were trained for urban warfare training. They were utilized for urban warfare training by many of the recruits or trainees, cadets, if you will, and they were also utilized for the active forces, or the permanent party as they were called, as they were not any longer trainees, but actual soldiers. They were utilized also for these forces in their training programs as they would go out to the field and conduct field training exercises, or an FTX. Well, this FTX was a brigade level FTX, or field training exercise. And there were 3 combat engineer battalions that struck this area right here. One that moved into the city, and it's along with this one here, moving into the city limits on its easternmost end before attacking and driving deep into the installation, having smashed its feeble fencing, as these were combat engineers, and they did a lot of reconnaissance activities, as that was a specialty of combat engineers, was to recon areas, especially fortified areas, and dismantle them, as well as conduct reconnaissance in force, as they were well equipped for the role. And they could lay assault bridges, they could remove fencing and barriers, they could plant charges for demolition, and many, many more activities. And these combat engineers made great use of all their assets in this coming battle. These were the perfect forces to assault an army post, especially one with such heavy firepower. Their opponent, who opposed them, the 75th Field Artillery Brigade, in this sector right here, again, were conducting an FTX, although they had live ammunition available, and these were a very heavy artillery force. They were rocket heavy, as far as they were primarily a rocket force, with MLRS battalions and a HIMARS battalion, with the 2nd of the 18th being an MLRS, the 3rd of the 13th being an MLRS, the 2nd of the 20 being an MLRS. They also had their 100th Brigade Support Battalion, which was their logistical and support assets, and their headquarters of Headquarters Battery, which was a company size unit. And of course, the 1st of the 14th, which was a HIMARS force. So there were 3 MLRS battalions and 1 HIMARS battalion. And this was the 1st of the 79th, whose Alpha and Bravo battery remained to help coordinate training with all of these different units, including the visiting units that came here specifically to train with the units on Fort Sill, including the 15th Sustainment Brigade, which was part of the forces that came to the area from El Paso and Fort Bliss, which was an earlier battle covered, as well as the 1st Division, 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade, which was right here. These forces came to train with the 75th Field Artillery Brigade and had training coordinators in the form of Alpha and Bravo Company, where this battalion marker is, although it's not the whole battalion, it's just a marker, whereas the rest of their battalion was part of the force protection mission down in Shepherd, now being destroyed, as that installation was also going up in flames at the same time as this one was, as they were both attacked by the same 77th Group Army, conducting both operations with lightning speed. As these forces began also their operation at 1:40, by the time they drove deep into the installation, some 15 minutes had gone by and it was nearly 2 a.m. when the missiles began to fly, similar to how these forces likewise reached their objectives in about the same amount of time. This happened at the same time, as well as this single combat engineer battalion, once again seizing the southwest corner airfield of the installation at its far southwest corner. And here, they would have a battle with an independent artillery battalion, being a unit here at Fort Sill. It was the 3rd of the 13th, an MLRS battalion. And they were part of the 75th Field Artillery Brigade. So as this was all underway, and there were training forces mixed in with these forces, and of course the home and the tenant units and the visiting units, the combat engineers struck when these forces least expected it. And where these 3 combat engineer battalions struck right up the middle, they hit this 100th Brigade Support Battalion exceedingly hard, as well as the 3rd of the 13th here, which rushed down into the area with the 100th Brigade Support Battalion. And they began to immediately take enormous fire from 2 rocket battalions of the PHL-11s, in addition, which were the 122mm rockets. All of the firing batteries comprising each of these battalions were firing their rockets. So there were dozens of these rocket systems firing all at the same time, in addition to the PLZ-05 155mm howitzer battalion here, as this field artillery brigade here was a mix of 155, 152, and A300 A300 long-range rocket artillery being 1 battalion of that, 2 battalions of the PHL-11 122mm multiple launch rocket systems. There were 2 battalions of PLZ-05 155mm howitzers, and the 2 remaining battalions were PLL-66 152mm howitzers. These forces here were firing their 155s and their 2 122mm battalions, firing all their firing batteries comprising them, firing their PHL-11s at all of these forces in this area, hitting them extremely hard, while these combat engineer forces moved in and established a line of contact here. With these forces moving in up the center, these 3 whole battalions, these 2 battalions forming a line up here and helping to surround forces of the sustainment brigade here, being the 15th, surrounding one of its subordinate battalions while holding this line here. And also, what was occurring was at a later point in this fight, because this fight would last a little bit of time, there would be an attack from this mechanized infantry battalion moving up the highway and across to form the end of the line right here, as indicated by this line going up here. So, all in all, the battle was being carried out after these forces had already secured I-44. 1 moved into the area after their companies had spread out along this route to secure it, while leaving the other one to secure it. They had moved ahead to join these combat engineers in destroying the 75th Field Artillery Brigade, along with all the ancillary units that were in the area, as well as part of the 15th Sustainment Brigade, who happened to be trapped out in the middle of the same training area zone as these forces were here. They were partially in the main post in the inner training areas, and the rest were in the outer training areas at the time that these forces struck. And these forces, once again, struck at the same time. And in the previous video, these forces struck at the same time, but that was already covered. So as this fighting was already going on here, this has started as well. And we go to that map right here. What was occurring was, on this map, what you have right here is a huge area being saturated by 122mm rockets, HE rockets, or high explosive rockets, just landing and pounding this area. This signifies, this is the symbol of rocket artillery strikes. And this covers a huge portion of this map. And of course, there's more of it off map, because these are doing a time on target technique as well, where various different batteries, which is 8 of these launchers per battery, and one of them can cover a fairly large portion of a grid square, like roughly a third of a grid square, so like a third of a kilometer, a 1 by 1 kilometer box, a third of one. So if you're firing 3 systems where they're tiered to land over one another, you can fill up a whole grid square with 3 launchers alone. So you had 8 of these launchers in each battery, and you had roughly 5 firing batteries each firing. So you had 40 per battalion firing, and they were saturating huge areas, and there were 2 battalions firing. So you had a lot of rocket artillery landing and smashing forests and woods to bits, because this part of Oklahoma did have wooded areas. It had wooded areas. It was very interesting terrain. It had a lot of flat land, but then it had land that sort of jutted up, like hilly type land and terrain, and I guess you would call that a knob in terms of a large hill. But then it would be really flat in other areas. And it would also have forests in some areas, and other areas it wouldn't. Other areas would be more like prairies and open land. But in this area right here, you have some wooded areas. This being woods, this is a woods. This is woods, woods, woods. Some woods here along this ridge. This is a ridge, like just a elevated area of terrain, like just a large elevated area of terrain, like a ridge line. So along this ridge line, everything's getting saturated by rockets up here. This is where that other rocket battalion was coming from. The 3rd of the 13th was moving down into the area and was getting hit by all of these rockets, just destroying most of its MLRS systems. So most of the firing batteries, as there were 4 firing batteries in that battalion, were completely and totally destroyed. So there were a few MLRS systems that hurriedly raced down the side of this ridge where it wasn't too steep, where they could actually get their tracked vehicles down fairly safely. And they hurriedly made haste out of the area. They raced down this ridge along with a few trucks like this LMTV trying to race out of the area for its life. And it took some damage in the back, as indicated by the red, because there's shrapnel flying into the back of this covered truck. This MLRS system's taking a lot of damage as it goes down, as shrapnel's flying everywhere. This MRAP and these 2 troops here were completely KIA'd and wiped out. These troops were wiped out. These were wiped out. They were out in the open at the time of this rocket saturation. This LMTV truck was completely destroyed and shredded up by the HE and shrapnel of this enormous amount of rockets saturating this area. These troops are wiped out, are all surrounded in red. They're gone. This guy's injured trying to get away. He's wiped out by a fresh rocket barrage right in this area here. As these areas being saturated, more launchers are about to hit this area and saturate the rest of the ridge and get everybody else. This is a M270 MLRS trying to escape right here with some troops on the ground. This is a command vehicle, and it's being totally shot up by the nose cannon on this J-11 that came down as the troops called in for close air support. And although they were primarily flying air superiority and combat air patrol operations over the skies of the local area to maintain control of the skies for local air defense, they were armed with some limited ground munitions, as mentioned before. This fighter had fired its air-to-ground KD-88 TV Seeker guided missiles at this fuel truck right here and this M88 armored recovery vehicle right here, while it strafed this area here and totally shredded this command vehicle up and all these troops around it with blasting tipped ammunition. It's firing its 30 millimeter nose cannon. It's a huge round, just like on the IFVs with their autocannons and some helicopters. At the time, you see these arrows are completely encapsulated in red. That means they were destroyed when all these fresh rocket strikes came in here, 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 here. They totally saturated the rest of this ridge on and off map. So what ended up happening was essentially what you see is a panicked flight. As at the time before this attack even took place, as these forces of these combat engineers raced into the area, I mean, they hurried and smashed their way into the installation. And as the Americans had lost all their communications due to the cyber and anti-satellite strikes. They had no satellite or military networks due to the tandem cyber and anti-sat strikes. They had no ISR capabilities. They didn't know what was about to happen to them. So they were stuck out in a field training exercise, and ostensibly they had no awareness of anything that was going on. They just realized that their equipment was failing them as far as their communications equipment, because by this point, the electronic warfare began jamming their radios and they could no longer communicate, as the two H-6K heavy strategic bombers armed with those systems were now in the area and jamming all the radios and radars for the SEAD operation and the rest of the fighting. So that enabled these forces to get in extremely close, and pretty much as they were racing into the area, they pretty much kind of snuck up on all of these forces. And just as the rockets began to strike, these surviving forces that were on this edge of this ridge, as the first rockets hit back here before more came in and started to basically wipe out the whole grid square, they all raced down this ridge, just making great haste and trying to flee the area. But by that time, a full batch of 48 CH-901A loitering munitions with heat warheads were fired by the headquarters battalion of the 77th Combat Engineer Brigade. So these were on AI seeking mode, and they were looking for enemy vehicles to hit. Now, the Brigade Support Battalion, the 100th Brigade Support Battalion, which belonged to the 75th Field Artillery Brigade, which was his prime logistical unit, was using this mock-up FOB right here. And we're doing FOB training and resupply exercises where they would drive supplies in convoys along these range roads to supply the firing positions of their troops in different areas. As again, their forces were deployed all around these inner training areas in the main post and off the main post out in the outer training areas. And they were driving supplies to these different battalions and the headquarters of Headquarters Battery, which was just off the map, up the road a bit. As that was happening, this group had just left the FOB. Even though all their communications were jammed, they were trying to figure out what was going on. So they were going to conduct their regularly scheduled training mission to bring supplies to the headquarters of Headquarters Battery, just off the map here up the road a bit. And as they were doing that from this mock-up FOB, where they trained new recruits on using a FOB and being on a FOB, that was a common thing, especially during the Iraq War. They were sending these convoys out, and instantly they were attacked by a mixture of CH-901A loitering munitions armed with heat warheads, as this MRAP in the back was also cut to shreds, as the infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, and the armored engineering vehicles, as well as this was a combat engineer force, they were equipped with the GPZ-111A, which had a mine-clearing plow and a rocket-fired line charge for clearing mines, was equipping these forces here, as well as an assault bridge layer on this platoon here. They had a few different engineering vehicles, but they also had robots, sort of like the Special Operations Forces used the quad-legged robots. So did the combat engineers, as they were a prime reconnaissance and force sort of asset, being combat engineers, and they were used to attacking fortified areas. They had sent one of their demolition robots, armed with C4, to blast the side of this FOB completely open, as this was the exact type of installation that combat engineers were perfect for attacking. So under fire of their armed robots, they had both armed and they had both demolition robots that planted demolition charges as well as could remove things. They had arms and things on these robots. They were four-legged. These were armed with the machine guns, the 12.7 millimeter. These heavy machine guns, anti-materiel. Well, they were firing and giving fire support as this one crept forward, planted its C4 charges, and hurriedly moved back behind the relative safety of these dismounted troops and their vehicles, as they had these were in wheeled vehicles. They were in ZBD-08, wheeled IFVs and APCs. And their IFV version of the ZBD-08 had a 35 millimeter Gatling autocannon, which is very powerful, a 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax, and a rail for a single HJ-73C anti-tank missile, the shorter range ones, not the longer range HJ-08s, 9s, or 10s, but the 73C, which was still adequate for what they were needing it for. And they were firing their 35 millimeter autocannon, and these troops that were on a patrol, like a training patrol, they were patrolling around the FOB perimeter, they dropped into a wedge formation in the prone position and started to fire at these guys, but they got in a firefight, and these dismounted troops that left their vehicle, including these guys running out of the back of this ZBD-08 right here, and getting into the prone position as well in a wedge, as shown here by the contact line where they're being fired from. It's all in a wedge. They fired back and wiped these guys out and fired a few tube-fired 35 millimeter grenades from their tube-mounted grenade launchers beneath their QBZ-95 assault rifles. And they used their light machine guns and QBZ-95 rifles to basically wipe these guys out. While this happened and the CH-901As came in force, they called in airstrikes on all of these retreating forces as the quadcopter reconnaissance drones of the engineers had spotted all of these guys retreating, and airstrikes were promptly called in, and the nearest assets that could be used were 4 of their fighter aircraft in the area, 4 of the 4 fighters from the squad of J-11 fighters came into the area and began to strafe with their very powerful 30 millimeter nose cannons with blasting ammunition, and each of them dropped a 1,000 pound, or two 1,000 pound munitions apiece, as shown here, while they're strafing, and they each drop a 1,000 pounder, two 1,000 pounders per aircraft, as shown. And this one fired its KD-88 from further back off the map as they flew into the area. And they targeted these support unit trucks because fuel trucks were very important. Can't do much without fuel. And of course, the armored recovery vehicle was important as well. There were also armored ambulances in the form of M113 armored personnel carriers used as ambulances. And although they weren't completely targeted outright because they bore a large red cross on them as an ambulance, they did take a lot of stray rounds from the battlefield, as this battlefield was now erupting in fire. As these forces fleeing from all the artillery strikes ran from one peril into another, into a line of troops from this being a single company of combat engineer forces, they set off their huge C4 blast, which wiped out a lot of these men around the installation as the bot had planted the charges. And C4 is extremely powerful. It's very powerful, and it blew the guys along the wall away. These guys were gone, and it created a huge hole from which these armed robots could fire through with ease, as well as the vehicles firing their 12.7 millimeter machine guns all into this entire place. And of course, as that was already going on, as this happened immediately at the opening of this map and they moved out, they dropped their 2 1,000 pound munitions on this, what remained of the FOB after the C4 was set off, blasting this entire FOB and even destroying this MRAP that came too close to it, destroyed it. As these forces came around, they were hit by 4 different CH-901A loitering munitions, destroying this whole convoy of 4 LMTV trucks. Along with the 2 1,000 pounders dropped here, destroying this M113 armor personnel carrier that had a M250 cal machine gun mounted to it that moved into this area, an MRAP, like a Max Pro MRAP built by International. Of course, these were dismounted troops running into the area alongside these vehicles, along with a LMTV truck. They were all destroyed along with this MRAP here that moved here. These munitions are extremely powerful. Like when they landed right down here, they destroyed everything in its wake. And then these CH-901As were, of course, hitting MRAPs that moved into this area. This was hit. This hit this one. I mean, it was a massacre. These hit these LMTV trucks. This M88 vehicle right here, this armored recovery vehicle, is hit by this one and destroyed. And this M270 MLRS was hit by this one and destroyed. This was one of the rocket artillery vehicles that just barely escaped the massive rocketing going on up here, along with this one and this one here. So 3 rocket vehicles escaped this way, while another one escaped this way, only to be finished off by a new series of rocket fire. And what occurred down here was these troops also on a training patrol. These guys along the wood line here trying to sneak around. They were spotted with infrared and night vision optics, and they were lit up by the gunners with their 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns. They were lit up by an armed robot that sighted them as well, and fired at by their infantry fighting vehicle, ZBD-08 IFV version, with its massive 35 millimeter Gatling autocannon. It was a humongous round. Bigger than the 30, of course. Caused a lot more destruction. And, of course, this CH-901A crashed into this MRAP. It had stopped briefly here and was taking fire from 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire, and it fired back with its M250 cal as it was engaging. You know, all these forces here were being engaged, and this robot moved up and finished off these 2 squads here, although it was taking fire and was riddled with some holes by the time this exchange was over with. And this aircraft, of course, while this training squad, right when this map was being shown at the beginning, while they were being hit by some CH-901s and was getting down to this point here, they dropped two of their 1,000-pound munitions and blasted all these dismounted troops, and anybody that didn't get destroyed by CH-901As that made it this far were completely annihilated as far as like dismounts were concerned, because these vehicles were all hit one by one, just like out here. These combo of CH-901As, enormous rocket artillery fire, as well as strafing attacks, which lit up these forces over here, including this one as it moved. It was lit up and destroyed by the strafing as it hurriedly tried to move out of the area. And this one strafed and dropped its 2 1,000-pound munitions, blasting all these vehicles right here as they flew down into this area and annihilated them. And the strafing hit these vehicles as they tried to move out of the area. And they were also hit by CH-901As. And the strafing was also hitting troops up here too, and it was a horrible massacre what occurred in this area. CH-901A hit and finished off this retreating, already damaged M270 MLRS. This MRAP's destroyed by this one. And of course, you have all of the 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire and 35 millimeter autocannon fire just flying into the area. And these armored engineering vehicles had a 12.7 millimeter machine gun mounted on them, so they had a machine gun turret like the APCs of the Type 08 APC versions. Of course, this robot moved up. It was taking fire early on, along with this group here from these guys patrolling. And even a few shots fired from this hurriedly speeding off convoy, but then they moved up here. And these forces were firing right before being wiped out. So that's why there's even any green right there as far as contact against this robot. Here's a destroyed building, like a range administrative building. There were no KIAs, but there were a few WIAs on the Chinese side. But this was essentially an ambush. Even coming up on this side to fight the HHB, or the headquarters of headquarters battery of the whole 75th Brigade, was a whole different company. This was another company moving up into the area with its headquarters platoon staying back, similar to how the headquarters platoon's a little off the map. And right here you see two of the MRAPs, the armored recovery vehicle, the 2 trucks. There's more off the map too, other MRAPs and other vehicles, fueler, MV3 fueler, and all that. The headquarters platoon stayed back while this company, part of the same battalion as this company, moved one platoon here, one here, and one here. And they were taking fire right off the bat at first, too, until the airstrike and the CH-901As and they firing back finished them all off. There were also quite a bit of POWs netted out of this whole operation, as those forces that hadn't been outright annihilated, including some in these two vehicles back here, at least until these rockets hit and shrapnel flew in, they stayed in their vehicles for cover. And although rockets didn't directly hit this area, as it would have been danger close to their own troops, all of these vehicles, these armored ambulances, these guys are all gone. They're gone. All these red arrows indicate they're gone. They're gone because they were hit by the munitions dropped on the fob here when they pulled up too close. But they were all right. They took some damage from the blasts for these KD-88s here, this LMTV, but they surrendered. The armored ambulance surrendered. This MRAP, this APC, this M113, these two LMTVs, they surrendered. I think there are a few survivors over here too. This battle was over extremely fast, just like the SEAT operation. This one lasted a bit longer though. This one, instead of ending at 2:15, ended at 2:45. This was a long battle. It lasted essentially from the time the forces departed outside of the installation, reaching inside of it, until the time they arrived and ambushed them, along with the enormous artillery fire driving these forces away into the ambush, which was a essentially perfect slaughter. It was essentially a 50-minute long battle in its totality, from the time it took to get there till the time the last fighting right here ended in this particular sector. Although that was only one part of the fighting, as there was much more fighting going on. Although the combat engineer, 3 whole battalions, and you only saw 2 companies from one single battalion, as these had multiple companies comprising them. There are 8 companies per battalion. As these forces crushed the 100th Brigade Support Battalion at its training grounds, along with the neighboring headquarters of Headquarters Battery, other forces were still fighting along the perimeter against the mechanized infantry and the other combat engineers up here and here. And the combat engineers tasked with holding this part of the line that surrounded one of the 15th Sustainment Brigade's battalions, as well as its headquarters, while fighting another one, with another one moving over to reinforce it, to hold a line, a contact line against these combat engineers holding this whole area up here. So the fighting was very mixed up in this area. While they had a coherent contact line here, they had companies, other of their companies, facing this way, fighting these battalions in this company, as well as these battalions here. So they were kind of split between fighting these guys and fighting these guys, and they did manage to surround this whole battalion and this whole company while just holding off these two as this one came to reinforce this one to try and fight them off. But they continued to hold, and the fighting continued. Also, at the same time as all of this was going on, tremendous air support was arriving in the form of the H-6K heavy strategic bombers, and the fighting that was going on the fringes here and here wouldn't last for very long, as they finally came in for their attack runs and began to basically carpet munition these forces out of existence. And there were 2 additional bombers from the bomber squadron moving into this area. And when this battle next is explored between this single combat engineer battalion fighting over the airfield against this American artillery battalion of MLRS artillery forces, as well as the other forces of the 1st Armored Division's Artillery Brigade here, this battalion ends up fighting many of their forces and prevailing due to supremacy of total air power, total air dominance, as well as their own firepower and missile strikes as well. This was a very, very heavy fought battle. And very soon in the fighting, shortly after 2:30, between 2:30 and 3:30, the 1st Aviation forces would begin arriving from the helicopter forces, the 77th Aviation Brigade of the 77th Group Army, and it would be carrying into battle troops of the 77th Special Operations Battalion with its transport helicopter battalions, and it would be coming in with its armed attack and armed reconnaissance helicopters as well to lend immense support to the 181st Combined Arms Brigade's ground forces, and would also insert special operations forces to perform a very daunting, serious operation to not only capture but completely hold the airfield, as by this point, American forces were breaking up and were beginning to essentially be found all throughout the post in different pockets trying to fight for their very lives against this enormous invasion, as unit cohesion began to evaporate rapidly, as units began to either be outright annihilated or they began to be so heavily hit that small groups of these units, like platoon size or smaller, began breaking off and beginning to try to look for a way out just to survive. And they were trying to fight their way out of very, very perilous situations that they were now in. And the Chi-Coms could not allow an escape. They either wanted them all KIA'd or they wanted them all as POWs. There were no other options. This battle became extremely intense. And it was only really just getting started between 140 and 230, as there's more to come in the next videos.